You don't touch the flag. The words cut through the chaos of the Washington airport like a blade. An airport manager's hand hovered inches from the stars and stripes draped over a soldier's casket. Travelers froze mid-step, phones lowered. What they thought was just another delay was about to become a moment that no one would ever forget. At the heart of it stood a tomb guard, silent, disciplined, unyielding, protecting a fallen brother. What happened next would divide the terminal, force strangers to choose sides and remind a nation of the cost of its freedom. Follow my story to the end and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has reached. The sound of rolling suitcases, clattering heels, and muffled announcements filled the concourse like a steady drumbeat. Screens flashed with destinations: Los Angeles, Chicago, Dallas. But for Sergeant Michael Carter, none of it mattered. His eyes never wavered from the casket draped in the American flag, now resting solemnly at the edge of the arrivals hall. The fabric rippled under the blast of cold air from the sliding doors. The stars and stripes gleamed perfect, each fold pressed with the reverence of a century of tradition. Michael stood beside it, white-gloved hands clasped at his waist, his uniform crisp and unyielding. The badge on his chest, a tomb guard's badge, glimmered under fluorescent light. To most of the crowd, he was just another soldier. To those who knew that badge was rarer than any medal of valor, worn only by those who guarded America's most sacred ground. But Michael wasn't here for recognition. He was here because of a promise. 3 days ago, in a dim office overseas, he'd received the folded letter with words that carved into his chest like shrapnel. Private First Class Ethan Ward killed in action. Ethan, the kid with a crooked smile. The one who carried crayon drawings from his daughter in his helmet. The one who'd once pulled Michael from the dirt of Afghanistan, saving his life. The same Ethan who, on their last night together, had said, "If I don't make it back, promise me this, bring me home through the front. No back hallways. No shortcuts. Full honors." Now that promise was all that kept Michael steady. He could still see Ethan's grin in the firelight, hear him say, "You think too much, Mike. Sometimes you just gotta feel it." He could still smell the dust, taste the grit of sand and smoke. Ethan wasn't supposed to be gone. Yet here he was, back in America, but silent, covered by the one flag that bound them both. Michael drew a slow breath, steadying the storm within. His job was clear: escort Ethan through the terminal, let the people see him, let them understand the cost etched in that flag. But already trouble stirred. Across the terminal, a tall man in a tailored gray suit strode forward, his jaw tight, a clipboard clutched like a weapon. Richard Collins, operations manager, moved with the urgency of a man who measured time in seconds and disruptions in dollars. His eyes swept over the honor guard assembling the casket, and finally Michael. His lips pressed into a thin line. "This won't do." Collins muttered, his voice carrying just enough to reach his assistant Sarah, who trailed behind. "We're at peak departures, 20 flights in the next hour. We can't shut down half the concourse for this." Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking to the casket. "Sir, the airport director approved the main route." Collins stopped short, turning sharply on her. "The service corridors are there for a reason. Quiet, efficient. No disruption. Get it rerouted." Michael's head turned slightly, his eyes narrowing. He didn't speak, not yet, but the tension in his jaw betrayed that he'd heard. His grip on his gloves tightened. The crowd began to gather, travelers, slowing, children tugging at parents' sleeves. Phones lifted, catching the sight of the soldier standing guard. A whisper rippled through the air. "Who is he? What's happening?" Near the front, a woman with silver hair clutched the hand of a little girl. Helen Ward's face bore the years of service as an army nurse and the grief of a mother burying her son. Beside her, 10-year-old Lily's eyes widened, fixed on the casket. Grandma Lily whispered, tugging Helen's hand, "Is that Daddy's plane?" Helen's throat closed. She nodded, tears brimming, but no words came. Michael saw them. His chest ached, but his face remained carved from stone. He thought of Ethan's voice the night before their final mission. "If I don't come back, make sure Mom knows I wanted it this way. Make sure Lily sees me come home right." That promise burned brighter now, especially with Helen and Lily watching. Collins advanced his polished shoes, clicking like a metronome of defiance. He raised his clipboard, tapping it against his palm. "Sergeant, he called out, his tone sharp. We've prepared an alternative route. The service corridors will take you directly to the loading area. Much more efficient. Michael turned his head slowly, his voice steady, deep, carrying the weight of Arlington itself. Private First Class Ethan Ward will proceed through the main terminal. As arranged. As required. Collins's eyes narrowed. I understand your sentiment, Sergeant, but this isn't about symbolism. This is about thousands of passengers whose schedules will be disrupted. We can't have delays ripple through the system. Michael's gaze hardened. This is not symbolism. This is honor. The air seemed to thin. The nearby crowd leaned in. Collins stepped closer, lowering his voice as if that might soften the steel in Michael's stance. Sergeant, be reasonable. No one will know the difference if he goes through the service corridor. It's faster. Michael's words came like a verdict. Everyone will know, especially his family, especially his brothers in arms. Hiding him in a back hallway is not faster. It's shameful. Sarah shifted uneasily, her hand brushing the radio at her side. Travelers glanced between the two men, sensing the clash. Somewhere a child asked, "Why won't they let him through?" Collins pressed on, jaw tight. Sergeant, I am responsible for this terminal. Efficiency comes first. Michael took a single step forward, closing the space between them. His voice dropped, but every syllable rang with unshakable authority. There are duties older than your airport, protocols older than your position. Ethan Ward died serving his country. He will not be hidden in death. The crowd went silent, phones lowered. Even the overhead announcement paused as if the terminal itself held its breath. Then Collins did the one thing no one expected. He reached out his hand, brushing the edge of the flag. Michael's reaction was instant. His gloved hand snapped forward, gripping Collins's wrist with firm, measured force. His eyes locked on the man's, his words low, unwavering. You don't touch the flag. The words weren't loud, but they carried like thunder through the hushed concourse. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Veterans straightened, parents pulled children closer, and Helen Ward's hand flew to her mouth. Michael held Collins's wrist for 3 heartbeats, then released it, his face impassive, but his eyes blazing with restrained fury. The moment had shifted. No one in that terminal would ever forget it. The silence that followed Michael's words weighed heavier than the roar of any jet engine. For a fleeting moment, it felt as if the entire terminal, the lights, the polished tiles, even the departure screens had frozen in place. Collins recoiled, rubbing his wrist, his face pale with shock, but quickly darkening with indignation. Yet Michael's posture never wavered. His arms returned to his sides, his white gloves steady, his eyes fixed forward as though carved from stone. The casket at his side seemed to radiate its own gravity, drawing the gaze of every onlooker. The flag shimmered faintly beneath the airport's artificial light, an anchor of solemnity in a sea of anxious travelers. For Michael Carter, this wasn't just a moment of defiance, it was the continuation of a vow etched into his bones. His mind drifted unbidden back to Arlington, to the quiet rhythm of duty that had defined him. He remembered the first time he walked the marble steps leading to the tomb of the unknown soldier. The silence there wasn't empty, it was alive, charged, demanding reverence. Every recruit who trained for the old guard learned the rituals. 21 steps, 21 seconds, flawless, turns, precision, beyond the human eye. But for Michael, it was more than ritual. It was a covenant with the fallen, with history, with every nameless soldier whose sacrifice deserved to echo through eternity. The badge on his chest had not come cheaply. He could still feel the blistered feet from endless drills, the strain of holding a rifle motionless under the blazing sun or biting winter winds. He could still hear his instructor's voice, clipped and relentless. Perfection is the minimum. These men and women gave their lives. You will give them your best. It was during those long nights on silent guard that Michael's friendship with Ethan had grown into something deeper than camaraderie. He could still see Ethan leaning against a Humvee under the desert stars, grinning like mischief itself. You ever stop thinking, Mike Ethan had said one night, tossing a pebble into the dust? You carry the whole world on your shoulders. You gotta learn to just feel it. Michael had smirked, shaking his head. Somebody's gotta keep you alive, Ethan. You're chaos. I'm the compass. Ethan had laughed then, that unrestrained, reckless laugh that cut through the tension of the war like a lifeline. Later, after too many close calls, that laughter became Michael's anchor. In the darkest moments, he'd remind himself, if Ethan can laugh, maybe we'll survive this. And then came the ambush. Michael had replayed it 1,000 times in his head. The sudden rattle of gunfire, the eruption of sand and fire. He'd been too slow that night, just 1 second behind. But Ethan hadn't hesitated. On your left, Mike Ethan had shouted, slamming into him, knocking him down as a spray of bullets cut the air where Michael's head had been. They'd hit the dirt together, hearts pounding. Michael remembered the ringing in his ears, the searing heat of adrenaline. Ethan, bleeding from his shoulder, had grinned through the pain. That's what brothers do. It was later under a desert moon when Ethan's voice had shifted from laughter to gravity. If anything happens to me, Mike, promise me, don't let them sneak me out the back. Bring me through the front where people can see. My dad always said a soldier deserves to be seen. Michael had locked eyes with him. I promise. That promise bound him now here in this terminal, where time seemed to have stopped. Across the hall, Helen Ward's breath came shallow as she watched the confrontation unfold. The lines on her face told stories of battles fought in hospitals and field tents of soldiers lost of wounds that never healed. She'd spent a lifetime patching up others, but nothing had prepared her for this moment, seeing her son return not in triumph, but in silence beneath the flag. Beside her, Lily's small voice broke through the stillness. Grandma, why is that man trying to move? Daddy. Helen tightened her grip on her granddaughter's hand. Because some people don't understand, sweetheart. But that soldier, she nodded toward Michael. He does. He'll protect your daddy's honor. Lily's wide eyes flickered to Michael. To her, he looked like a statue, untouchable, a hero out of one of her father's stories. She pressed her crayon drawing tighter against her chest, the one she had made for her dad weeks before. Meanwhile, Collins tried to reclaim control. He straightened his suit, forcing composure back into his voice. Sergeant, he said sharply, this display is unnecessary. We have protocols to maintain. You are jeopardizing airport operations. Michael's reply was quiet, but immovable. You call it a display. I call it duty. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Some nodded. Others exchanged glances. A man in a Marine Corps cap stepped closer, his weathered face solemn. I lost brothers in Vietnam, he said, his voice steady, despite age. They never came home. Don't you dare send this one through a back hallway. The word struck the crowd like a spark. Travelers who moments ago had been impatient now stood straighter, watching with a reverence they hadn't expected to feel inside an airport. A mother hushed her son. A businessman closed his laptop. A teenage girl slipped her phone back into her pocket, tears forming. Michael felt the shift, but he remained still, his expression composed. He wasn't here to inspire a crowd, he was here to keep a promise. Collins bristled, but for the first time his voice wavered. We can't delay thousands of passengers for one man. Helen stepped forward, then her voice trembling yet strong. That one man is my son. He gave his life so thousands could keep theirs. And you want to hide him like an inconvenience? Lily's small voice echoed hers, piercing and innocent. That's Daddy's flag. Don't hide Daddy. The terminal grew even quieter. Collins' shoulders slumped just slightly. His confidence cracking under the weight of grief made human tangible. Michael's gaze shifted briefly toward Helen and Lily. Their pain was his compass, as real as Ethan's voice had been that night under the desert stars. He turned back to Collins, his words final. We walk through the main terminal. That is non-negotiable. For the first time, Collins had no immediate reply. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted to the growing crowd, to the veterans saluting, to the children staring wide-eyed to the flag itself. He was losing control. Michael stood unshaken, a sentinel in scarlet and black, guarding not just a fallen comrade, but the very meaning of the promise they'd shared. And as the honor guard prepared to lift the casket, the air in the terminal thickened with something Collins couldn't measure on a clipboard reverence. The honor guard's boots struck the polished floor in a cadence that thinned the terminal's noise to a hush. Each step was deliberate, a metronome of respect that made even the scrolling flight boards seem to slow. The casket rested for the moment, the bearers waiting on Sergeant Michael Carter's nod. He fixed his gaze just above the flag's top edge, the place he'd learned to look so his eyes wouldn't betray the storm inside. Across the rope line, Helen Ward squeezed Lily's hand until the girl glanced up. "You okay?" she asked softly. Lily nodded without letting go. "Is he cold in there?" Helen's mouth trembled. "He doesn't feel cold now, baby." Lily shifted the paper she had been guarding all morning. "I brought the drawing." She unfolded it carefully, a smiling stick figure in uniform, a smaller one with pigtails, and a huge flag filling the sky. In the corner, purple letters leaned "Daddy, love Lily." Helen smoothed a crease with her thumb. "He'd like that," she whispered, eyes flicking toward Michael the soldier who had stood like a wall when everything else felt like water. On the periphery of the crowd, operations manager Richard Collins paced his phone pressed to his ear. "We're at risk of cascading delays," he muttered. "Authorize reroute through service quarters quietly." He stopped, jaw tightening, as the answer came. He ended the call unsatisfied. His assistant, Sarah Martinez, stood half a step away. Radio silent gaze fixed on the flag. "People are forming up on their own," she said quietly. Collins turned, irritation flashing. But then he saw travelers edging back from the central walkway, creating space without being told. A deadheading pilot stepped aside and squared his shoulders. A flight attendant set down a roller bag and clasped the hand of a small boy who had asked why everyone looked serious. And a man in a faded USMC cap. George Roberts stood stiff with palm against his brimmed shoulders, straight as memory. Collins frowned. "We can't lose control to a spectacle." Sarah's eyes didn't leave the casket. "This isn't a spectacle." Michael lifted his chin and gave a slight nod to the bearers. The casket rose on 6 synchronized breaths. The flag fluttered faintly, stars shivering under the airport's lights. "Daddy said flags have to be folded." "Perfect," Lily whispered. Helen's eyes blurred with a memory, Ethan on their porch in spring light, showing Lily how to fold a small cotton flag. "Keep your hands clean," he'd told her. "Never let it touch the ground." Folding it right is like promising to be your best. The memory cracked Helen's chest wide open, but she held steady. Heel-toe lift, the honor guard stepped. The sound turned the concourse into a hymn. Conversations died. Phones lowered. A TSA supervisor at the checkpoint leaned from his podium, removed his cap, and bowed his head. Even the automated voice announcing a gate change seemed to pause, as if the building itself understood. Michael's senses sharpened as they had on patrols. He registered the faint citrus sting of a cleaning solvent, the rasp of a suitcase wheel with a bent axle, the harsh, shallow breaths of the manager to his left. He measured the distance to the door's plotted pauses and calculated spacing. Duty had a mathematics to it. So did promises. An airline worker rushed forward with paperwork, froze at the sight of the flag, then stepped back, waiting. Impatience caged by respect. Little choices, Michael thought, make big promises visible. Colin shoved his phone into his pocket and barked, "Security. Help me open a lane to service." His voice carried just enough to reach Michael. Sarah didn't budge. "Sir, with respect, he's not a cart. He's a casket," Collins snapped. "And you have a job." Before Sarah could answer, George Roberts spoke calm and steady. "We all have a job." Collins met the older man's eyes, expecting anger. He found something worse for his argument patience. "You don't run this airport." "No," George said, voice low but resonant. "I just remember what it looks like when we forget what matters." Michael signaled for the guard to halt midway down the concourse. The bearers lowered the casket to the carriage for a brief pause. Michael stepped forward, one pace, white gloves folded, standing sentinel, so the people could see a soldier still kept watch. Helen drifted closer, the rope line no match for grief. Michael's gaze flicked to her, then to Lily. He didn't smile, ceremony forbade it, but his eyes softened. He remembered Ethan in the chow line bragging about Lily's school drawings with so much pride it filled the barracks. "Can I give him this now?" Lily asked, holding the drawing high. "Not yet, sweetheart," Helen said, swallowing hard. "We'll put it with him when it's time." The hush pressed down heavier than silence. Someone sniffled. Somewhere a prayer unspooled without sound. Colin stepped forward again, voice pitched for command. "If this continues, families will miss flights. There will be medical connections at risk business meetings." Helen turned on him, her grief hardening to steel. Families are here. My family is here. Collins froze. For the first time, his eyes registered the truth standing in front of him, a woman whose posture bore years of service and a child clutching a crayon drawing instead of a teddy bear. He fumbled. "Ma'am, I didn't mean." Helen cut him off with a small shake of her head. "Just let him come home right. That's all." A uniformed police officer drifted near, hand loose at his belt, eyes finding Michael's. Backup was offered, but unnecessary. The true line of defense was already here, a corridor of ordinary citizens bound by silent reverence. The officer nodded once and stepped back. Michael angled his head toward Collins. "You can help," he said evenly. "Tell your people this path is open. Open, not blocked. It will be faster than fighting it." Collins bristled. Yet when he glanced around, he saw Sarah already directing travelers to the sides with simple gestures. Compliance came easily when offered with respect. The knot in his chest tightened. The bearers reset their grips. The casket rose again. Helen exhaled, nearly sobbing. Lily pressed closer. "Grandma, did Daddy know this would happen?" Helen's voice carried something deeper than bone. He knew what he asked Michael to do. He knew his friend would keep a promise. The next stretch of steps carried them by tall windows. Winter sunlight poured in, scattering across the flag until it seemed to glow. A toddler waved, then caught himself and put his hand over his heart. His mother mirrored him, tears in her eyes. Michael felt the shift. Resistance had given way to reverence. This was no longer a fight to justify the procession. It was a choice to walk with it. He pictured the last turn toward the doors, Ethan's voice teasing him, always planning Mike, then that familiar laugh like a hand on his shoulder. A businessman in a rumpled suit murmured to no one in particular, "I was going to complain." Then I saw her. He nodded toward Lily. "I'll catch the next flight." George Roberts lowered his hand, flexing stiff fingers. From his pocket he pulled a ribbon frayed and bent from another war. He held it against his palm. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Collins shifted awkwardly, folding and unfolding his arms, nowhere to put his hands. He looked at Sarah, who met his eyes with calm certainty. For the first time, he wondered if maybe he was the one out of step. Michael halted the guard once more at the wide intersection where chaos usually reigned. Today the space opened willingly. He stepped forward and let two words fall into the silence. "Thank you." The words traveled in whispers up and down the corridor, multiplying like a prayer. Then the casket moved again. By the time they reached the terminal's final 100 feet, sunlight broke fully through the clouds. The flag blazed as if lit from within. Lily gasped. "He sees us," she whispered. Helen's tears spilled. "Maybe we finally see him." Michael didn't look at Collins again. He didn't need to. This was larger than any argument. It lived in the bowed heads, the hushed breaths, the simple decision of a crowd to honor sacrifice. The sliding doors yawned open. Cold air spilled in. Outside the hearse waited like a punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. "Forward," Michael commanded. The honor guard obeyed, and the airport moved with them. The cold air from the open doors whispered across the concourse, curling around polished shoes and stiff uniforms. Sergeant Michael Carter's focus stayed locked on the flag-draped casket, but he could feel the shift behind him. The crowd of travelers had turned from restless strangers into a living guard of honor. Every breath seemed synchronized, every eye fixed on the flag. The transformation should have silenced even the most stubborn dissent. But Richard Collins, the operations manager, wasn't ready to surrender his authority. Collins's shoes clicked sharply against the tile as he stepped into Michael's path once more. His face was pale but set in the grim mask of a bureaucrat, convinced he still had ground to stand on. The clipboard in his hands was dented at the corner where his grip had grown too tight. "Sergeant," he began, trying to pitch his voice low, professional, but the strain made it sharp. "I cannot allow this to continue. Our systems are already showing delays. Planes are waiting on tarmac clearance because this route is blocked. There are protocols." Michael didn't turn his head, didn't even blink. His voice emerged quiet, controlled. "This is Private First Class Ethan Ward. He will go through the main concourse." The words landed heavier than any order Collins had ever given in his pristine office upstairs. His jaw clenched, but he pressed on. "You're making a spectacle, Sergeant. There's a service elevator 30 yards away that would—" The sudden steady voice of Sarah Martinez, his assistant, interrupted. "Sir, look around you." Collins faltered, then followed her gaze. The concourse had transformed into a corridor of reverence. Passengers stood in neat lines along either side of the wide walkway, their luggage tucked away, their phones lowered. Even the loudspeaker that had just begun to announce a boarding call cut short as the airline employee at the gate muted her microphone with trembling fingers. "They're waiting," Sarah said, her eyes steady. Not for a plane. For him. Collins felt a flush creep up his neck. He turned, seeking an ally, but every set of eyes near him was on the casket, unflinching, unyielding. The authority he wielded in memos and meetings meant nothing here. Michael let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Respect isn't a delay." The words stung Collins more than he expected. He tried to rally. "This isn't your decision to make." "It isn't yours either," came another voice. George Roberts. The Vietnam veteran stepped forward again. His back was bent by age, but his presence filled the space. "That flag belongs to all of us who wore the uniform. That casket belongs to his family. And this path," he gestured down the wide corridor toward the sunlight, "belongs to honor. You don't get to reroute that." The crowd murmured in agreement. Collins swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how alone he stood. Michael's gaze flicked to Helen Ward, who clutched Lily's hand as though tethered by grief itself. She gave him a single nod. It was enough. Michael returned his eyes to the path ahead and spoke softly. "Forward." The honor guard resumed their steps, steady boots striking the floor in solemn rhythm. Each movement carried the casket closer to the doors, closer to the hearse waiting outside. But Collins wasn't finished. He strode beside the guard, his voice rising in desperation. "I'll have you removed if you don't comply. Security will. What Sarah's voice cracked louder now, startling even herself. Her radio remained untouched at her belt. "Remove a tomb guard from his fallen brother. Force a grieving mother and daughter through a back corridor." "No, sir. Not today." Collins turned stunned, but Sarah didn't flinch. Her voice steadied. "I won't give that order, not when the right path is clear." Michael allowed himself the smallest glance in her direction. A flicker of gratitude crossed his eyes before vanishing beneath his stone-like composure. The procession moved on. The flag glowed under shafts of winter sunlight slicing through the tall windows. Helen's steps slowed as she pulled Lily closer to the casket. The girl whispered, "Can I touch it?" Grandma Helen's voice trembled. "Not yet, sweetheart. Soon." Every head turned as Lily's words carried through the silence, reminding all that inside the coffin was not an idea, not a symbol, but a father. Collins fell back, his face flushed with a war he could not win. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then muttered to no one in particular, "Schedules matter." But the words sounded hollow even to him. The bearers halted once more at Michael's command, positioning the casket near the final turn. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel drifting in from the open doors. Outside the hearse gleamed black against the bright tarmac. Michael lifted his chin and spoke, his voice carrying clearly. "This is his path home." The crowd shifted closer, dozens of strangers now united in the same silent vow. A mother pulled her teenage son's cap from his head, pressing it to his chest. A businessman bowed awkwardly, ashamed of how quickly he'd nearly complained. A flight attendant slipped off her blazer, folding it carefully over her arm, in quiet respect. And through it all, Michael stood unwavering, a sentinel keeping his promise. The tension hadn't ended. Collins's pride still smoldered, his authority, still itching for recognition, but the tide had turned. The airport was no longer his. For this moment, it belonged to Private First Class Ethan Ward. The hearse outside gleamed beneath the winter sun, but the casket had not yet crossed the threshold. Sergeant Michael Carter ordered the honor guard to halt, his hand raised in a measured signal. He wasn't stalling for effect. He was guarding the pace, making sure every step of Ethan Ward's last walk home matched the gravity of the promise he had made. For a moment, the pause gave way to silence, so pure it seemed to stretch across decades. Michael's eyes locked on the flag, but his mind drifted back to the desert. He could smell it, the iron tang of blood, the acrid smoke from spent rounds. He was back in Afghanistan, pinned down in a narrow valley where the moon lit up jagged rock and enemy fire cut through the night. He saw the flare of muzzle flashes, heard the thunderclap of rifles echoing through the canyon. And then he heard Ethan's voice, raw, urgent. "On your left!" "Mike." The next memory came like a blow. Ethan lunging, tackling him to the ground as tracer fire lit up the air where Michael had stood. Pain, dust, the weight of Ethan's body pressing him into the dirt. And then Ethan's laugh, absurd and reckless, even as blood seeped from his shoulder. "That's what brothers do," Ethan had said, brushing off Michael's frantic thanks. But Michael remembered the shadow in his friend's eyes afterward. The laughter had returned, but it was tempered a little quieter, as though Ethan had begun to feel the weight of the future pressing in. Later, under the pale desert stars, Ethan had grown serious. His voice carried not the swagger of a soldier, but the certainty of a man who knew time was short. "Mike, listen. If I don't come back one day, don't let them sneak me out the back. Promise me that. Full honors through the front where people can see. My dad used to say the worst thing wasn't dying for your country. It was being forgotten." Michael had swallowed hard. "I promise." That vow spoken in dust and blood was why he stood here now holding firm against every demand to take Ethan through a corridor meant for baggage carts. The crowd felt the weight of that unspoken memory in Michael's stance, though none of them knew the details. They only knew they were witnessing something too sacred to be rushed. Richard Collins, however, still couldn't see it. The operations manager adjusted his tie with jerky motions, frustration radiating from every stiff angle of his body. He stepped forward, his voice sharp enough to cut the hush. "Sergeant, this is absurd. These delays cost us thousands of dollars every minute. Protocols exist for efficiency. We can't hold up an international terminal because you feel sentimental about." Michael's head turned just slightly, his gaze piercing enough to stop Collins mid-sentence. His voice came out calm but steel-lined. "This is not sentiment. This is duty, and you will not dishonor him." Collins bristled. "I am responsible for this terminal. You are out of line." Helen Ward's voice rose suddenly from the crowd. "No, you are." The grief-hardened mother stepped forward, pulling Lily with her. Her shoulders straightened her nurse's training, lending her the bearing of someone who had stood beside too many caskets. "That's my son in there. He fought so men like you could argue about schedules instead of bullets. Don't you dare treat him like cargo." Collins flinched. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Lily clutched her grandmother's hand tighter, her small voice breaking through the tension. "That's my daddy's flag. Please don't hide him." A collective shiver ran through the crowd. Strangers blinked back tears. A young woman in airline uniform pressed her hands together, whispering something that sounded like a prayer. Even George Roberts, the Vietnam veteran, lowered his head and saluted again, this time slower, his hand trembling. Michael's eyes softened as they flicked toward Lily. He remembered Ethan pulling a crayon drawing from his helmet, his face alight with pride. "My girl made this," he had said, smoothing it over the inside of his helmet. "Keeps me safe." That drawing had survived 3 tours. "Ethan hadn't." "Forward," Michael said at last. His voice cut through grief and bureaucracy alike, commanding in its simplicity. The honor guard lifted the casket again, their movements synchronized like one living organism. The crowd leaned back respectfully, forming a wider corridor, but Collins, stubborn and desperate to reassert control, darted to the side. He signaled to 2 uniformed airport security officers who had just arrived. "Escort them to the service corridor," he ordered. The officers hesitated, their eyes falling on the casket, then on Michael. The weight of the flag seemed to freeze them in place. One officer murmured, "Sir, I don't think—" "Do it." Collins snapped his voice, breaking under pressure. Sarah Martinez stepped forward, planting herself between Collins and the security team. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. "Sir, if you give that order, you'll disgrace yourself and this airport. That soldier goes through the front." Collins turned on her, stunned. "You're insubordinate." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I'm human." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Collins's face flushed red, the thin veneer of authority peeling away. He reached out, almost in desperation, and brushed the flag again. Michael moved instantly, seizing his wrist a second time. His voice dropped low, dangerous in its restraint. "I told you once. You don't touch the flag." This time Collins's legs wavered under the weight of shame. The crowd erupted not in shouts, but in a tidal silence heavier than condemnation. Their eyes bore down on him, judgment he couldn't escape. Michael released him slowly, his face still composed, but the finality in his words undeniable. "Stand aside." And for the first time Collins did. The procession moved forward once more. The sound of the honor guard's boots carried like thunder through the stillness. The promise lived in every step. The honor guard advanced, their movements flawless, the flag glowing under slanting beams of winter sunlight. The crowd instinctively stepped back, forming a clean corridor, as if choreographed by something older than orders. Each footfall of the pallbearers echoed across the polished floors, a drumbeat steady enough to drown out the rolling wheels of suitcases and the murmurs of the terminal. For Sergeant Michael Carter, every step forward was a step back into memory. The tight grip of his gloves reminded him of the rifle he'd carried on post at Arlington, motionless for hours, refusing even to scratch an itch. He'd learned then that discipline was a language that silence and precision could speak louder than words. Here in the chaos of a public terminal, that same language transformed strangers into witnesses. Helen Ward clutched Lily close as they followed the casket's slow progress. The child's eyes tracked the stars on the flag wide with a mixture of pride and fear. Grandma Lily whispered, "Do you think Daddy knows we're here?" Helen's throat caught, but she steadied her voice. "I think he knows, sweetheart. I think he sees every step." The words rippled through the people nearest them. A businessman who had been checking his watch lowered his wrist, ashamed of his impatience. A teenage girl with earbuds pulled them out, her face flushing as tears slipped down. And George Roberts, the Vietnam veteran, drew in a long breath and saluted again, stiff but proud. Richard Collins trailed just behind his clipboard, hanging limp now at his side. His confidence had fractured, yet stubbornness still gnawed at him. His mind raced through metrics and timetables, but every glance at the crowd unsettled him further. They weren't passengers anymore, they were participants, and none of them were looking at him. Sergeant Collins tried again, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Think of the system. Think of the flights being held. This isn't sustainable." Michael didn't break stride. His reply was steady. "Honor is always sustainable." The words cut deep. Sarah Martinez, walking a few paces back, met Collins's eyes. "He's right," she said simply. The procession reached the wide intersection of gates where foot traffic usually tangled in impatient knots. Today, however, it was empty. Travelers had already shifted to the sides, forming a corridor as wide as a runway. On both flanks, people stood shoulder to shoulder, pilots, flight attendants, tourists with backpacks. Families clutching children, all united in silence. Michael commanded a halt. The pallbearers froze, lowering the casket with practiced care. The flag caught the light, radiant as if it breathed. Michael took one pace forward, placing himself at the casket's head. The silence deepened so complete it felt alive. Then softly a voice broke through. "My son loved baseball," Helen said. Her voice was low, but it carried across the hush. "He wanted to be a pilot when he was Lily's age. He used to tell me, 'Mom, when I fly, you'll be the first passenger.'" Her lips trembled, but her spine held firm. Instead, he gave his wings for his squad. Lily, clutching the drawing, whispered, "Daddy said he'd always come back." And he did. The words pierced every heart within earshot. A woman in uniform swallowed back tears. A man lowered to one knee, bowing his head. The silence was no longer stillness, it was reverence. Collins's shoulders sagged. He felt the last shreds of his authority slip through his fingers. The efficiency awards on his office wall flashed in his mind, meaningless now. What had he been protecting? A schedule numbers on a screen? In front of him was sacrifice itself, wrapped in cloth that demanded awe. Michael turned slowly, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, then landing on Collins. His voice dropped low, each word a weight. "This moment is not yours to control. It belongs to him. It belongs to his family. It belongs to every soldier who never made it home." Collins's lips moved, but no sound came. Michael nodded once to the honor guard. The casket lifted again. The crowd leaned back in perfect symmetry, their line now unbroken from the security checkpoint all the way to the sliding doors. An airline worker abandoned his desk to join the formation. A mother hushed her restless toddler with a finger to her lips, and the child, sensing the gravity, fell silent. Then, without prompting, George Roberts' voice rang out, cracked but clear. "Eyes right." Instinctively, veterans in the crowd obeyed, snapping into salute. The gesture spread, not perfect, not uniform, but powerful. Heads bowed, hands pressed over hearts. It was no longer an airport. It was holy ground. Collins stumbled back the clipboard, slipping from his grasp and clattering to the tile. No one looked at him. No one cared. Michael kept his eyes forward, but inside he felt Ethan's presence like a steady hand on his shoulder. "We made it, brother," he thought. "You're going home right." The procession turned the final corner toward the doors. Sunlight blazed across the floor, casting the flag in hues of fire and gold. Lily gasped softly. "Look, Grandma, it's like Daddy's flag is glowing." Helen nodded, tears spilling freely now. "That's because it carries more than cloth, Lily. It carries him." The honor guard moved forward again, each step resonating with the gravity of sacrifice. The sliding doors opened and cold air swept in, mingling with the warmth of reverence that filled the terminal. The hearse stood ready, its polished surface gleaming black as stone. Michael's voice, low but unwavering, broke the silence one final time. "Forward. To Arlington." And the people moved with him. The hearse outside gleamed like obsidian under the pale winter sun, but the transition from concourse to curb was not yet complete. Sergeant Michael Carter raised his hand subtly, commanding the honor guard to pause once more. His discipline made it seem deliberate, not hesitant, the kind of precision that lent weight to ritual. The casket rested steady, the flag pristine, each fold still sharp despite the countless eyes it had endured. For a long breath, the crowd remained frozen with it. Travelers clutched luggage but didn't move. A baby whimpered but was hushed instantly by her mother, who pressed her cheek against the child's hair as if shielding her from a world too heavy. The airport was transformed. The frantic pulse of departures and announcements had given way to a heartbeat measured by respect. But Richard Collins, the operations manager, stood at the edge of the path like a man watching his empire dissolve. His voice returned quieter but jagged. "Sergeant, this has gone far enough. The main corridor is shut down. Do you understand the chaos this causes?" Michael turned his head just slightly, his eyes cutting across Collins like a blade of glass. "You don't understand the chaos he died in. This isn't chaos. This is order, the only order that matters." The words struck harder than any raised tone could. Collins faltered, gripping his clipboard as though it were an anchor, but the authority in his voice no longer carried. His protest felt small against the immensity of the moment. Helen Ward stepped closer to the rope line, her voice carrying with a strength born from years of tending to soldiers on battlefields. "My son never asked for anything except to serve. And when he couldn't serve anymore, he asked one thing, that he be brought home right. Don't you dare stand in the way of that." The crowd murmured, emboldened. A young man in civilian clothes, his Marine Corps tattoo visible on his forearm, spoke up. "She's right. You can make schedules tomorrow, but today you make history." Collins's face flushed, but he no longer had words sharp enough to cut through. He fell back his clipboard, trembling in his grip, as though even he now understood the futility of arguing with duty. Michael's focus, however, never wavered from the casket. He allowed the silence to settle again, then commanded softly, "Forward." The pallbearers stepped in unison, their boots echoing in a rhythm that filled the concourse like a drumbeat of reverence. As they neared the doors, Sarah Martinez moved closer to Collins, lowering her voice. "Sir, sometimes leadership means knowing when to stop talking." He shot her a glare, but the weight of her words stayed with him. For once, he had no rebuttal. Michael's eyes flicked briefly toward Helen and Lily. The little girl still held her drawing, its crayon colors vivid against the somber tones around her. She clutched it like a lifeline, her gaze never leaving the stars on the flag. Grandma Lily whispered, "Can I give it to him now?" Helen's throat tightened. "Soon, sweetheart, when we reach the hearse." The crowd parted further, instinctively moving as one. A corridor of strangers had become a living testament, fathers lifting children to see business travelers dropping their phones to their sides, even a janitor stepping back with mop in hand, his eyes damp. And then just as the honor guard reached the threshold, Collins snapped. He lunged forward, his hand reaching out desperately, not for the casket this time, but for control. "Enough," he shouted. "You can't shut down my terminal for a—" His words choked as Michael pivoted quicker than seemed possible in such a solemn procession. The sergeant's white-gloved hand rose not in violence, but in an unmistakable gesture of warning. His voice thundered, though it remained low. "You will not dishonor him." The hush that followed was absolute. Even Collins froze his chest, heaving the clipboard nearly slipping from his fingers. He saw it in Michael's eyes, restraint fury, and the full weight of a promise stronger than any rule in a handbook. The silence broke not with protest, but with the voice of George Roberts. The old veteran, his cap clutched over his heart, stepped forward. "Son, I carried men to choppers who never made it home. If I had seen one of those boys hidden away in a hallway, I'd have carried their memory like a wound. Let him walk. Let us see him. That's all we ask." The crowd stirred again, their murmurs gathering into quiet unity. Collins looked around, his isolation complete. Michael's voice came softer now, but just as commanding. "Step aside." And finally Collins did. The honor guard pressed forward. The sliding doors yawned open, cold air rushing in to meet them. Outside, the hearse gleamed black, waiting to carry Ethan Ward to Arlington. The terminal, filled with people of every age and origin, stood still, heads bowed, hearts heavy, some saluting, others pressing hands to their chests. Michael led the casket into the light, his every step an unbroken vow. The winter air rushed in sharper now, carrying the smell of jet fuel and cold tarmac. The honor guard advanced toward the waiting hearse, their steps a cadence that bound silence to every onlooker. Sergeant Michael Carter marched at the head, his eyes fixed forward, but every nerve inside him burned with the memory of Ethan Ward's laughter and the desert where the promise had been made. Behind the rope line, Helen Ward pulled Lily close. The child's drawing had begun to crumple in her small hands, the crayon colors smudged where her grip had grown too tight. She held it against her chest as though it could reach her father through the wood and steel of the coffin. "Grandma," she whispered, "will Daddy see it if I put it on the flag?" Helen's throat ached. "Yes, baby. He'll see it." At that moment the casket tilted as the bearers slowed. Michael's hand rose, commanding another halt. His instincts told him the moment mattered. This pause was not a break in rhythm, but a recognition of something sacred. The crowd, sensing it, fell even deeper into stillness. No phones rose, no whispers stirred. Richard Collins, still lingering just behind, finally broke under the weight of silence. His voice cracked, desperate. This is unsustainable. You're disrupting an international airport. There are laws, there are rules." Michael turned to him fully. This time, his stare hard as stone. His voice emerged like a verdict. "There are laws older than your rules. This flag is one. This promise is one." Collins's lips trembled. "You can't just ignore protocol." Michael cut him off, his tone unwavering. "Protocol is what brought us here, but honor will take him home." The authority in Michael's voice left Collins reeling. The clipboard slipped from his hand, clattering onto the tile, but he didn't stoop to pick it up. His face, once flushed with self-assurance, now sagged with doubt and humiliation. It was then that Sarah Martinez stepped forward, her voice carrying more weight than rank. "Sir, look around you. No one's missing their flights. No one's angry. They're standing with him." Collins really looked for the first time. He saw businessmen with heads bowed, children pressed against their mothers, veterans saluting through tears. Even airline workers lined up along the glass, their hands over their hearts. The terminal was not disrupted. It was transformed. Before Collins could respond, George Roberts spoke again, his voice carrying the gravel of years. "You're not in charge here, son. He is," he nodded toward Michael. "And more than that, he is." He gestured to the casket. "You just don't see it yet." Collins's chest rose and fell. For once, he had no reply. Michael pivoted back toward the hearse, raising his voice for the first time. "Forward." The bearers lifted the casket again, every step synchronized, every motion flawless. The flag rippled, catching the wind as the sliding doors fully opened. Outside, ground crew workers removed their caps, bowing their heads. A fuel truck driver paused mid-task, his hand finding his chest. Helen and Lily walked closer now, their presence allowed within the formation. Helen's eyes never left the casket, her lips moving silently in prayer. Lily clutched her drawing, trembling but determined. As they reached the final stretch of polished floor before the curb, Collins stumbled forward once more. His hand, shaking, rose toward the flag. "At least, let me help," he stammered. The gasp that rippled through the crowd was immediate. Michael spun his gloved hand, snapping forward, gripping Collins's wrist with unyielding force. His words cut sharper than any shout. "I told you twice, don't touch the flag." The silence following was deafening. Collins's knees nearly buckled. He looked into Michael's eyes and found no malice there, only the restrained fury of a man guarding something greater than himself. Michael released him slowly, deliberately, then stepped back into position, the casket still unbroken in its journey. Helen's voice broke the tension, trembling but strong. "My son carried this flag into battle. He died under it. The least you can do is let him rest under it with dignity." Lily lifted her drawing with both hands, tears streaking her cheeks. "This is for you, Daddy." The child's voice cracked the terminal open. Grown men wiped their faces. Women pressed tissues to their eyes. Even hardened travelers, pilots, businessmen, security guards turned away, their shoulders shaking. Michael steadied himself, but inside Ethan's voice echoed again. "If I don't come back, Mike, make sure Mom knows I wanted it this way." And so Michael guided the honor guard to the threshold. The cold air whipped harder, carrying the scent of jet fuel and the sound of distant engines. The hearse waited, its back doors open like solemn arms. "Forward." Michael commanded one last time. The crowd parted wider, no longer strangers, but united in reverence. The casket moved across the threshold, flag blazing against the winter light. And the nation represented in that single airport terminal bore witness. The pallbearers carried the casket with a precision that seemed carved from stone, their boots striking the pavement outside the terminal in perfect unison. The winter air bit at their cheeks, and the flag rippled like fire in the wind, but their grip never wavered. Sergeant Michael Carter marched ahead, shoulders square, the embodiment of a vow made in the dust of a battlefield. Helen Ward and her granddaughter Lily followed closely, the child's crayon drawing clutched against her chest. Helen's face was drawn tight, but her eyes blazed with a mixture of grief and pride. Every step felt like both a weight and a release, the last walk she would take behind her son before he was carried to Arlington. Behind them, the crowd had spilled out of the terminal. Hundreds of people, travelers, workers, veterans, children, stood in silence on the curb, lining the path to the hearse. The chaos of the airport was gone. What remained was reverence. Richard Collins lingered at the doorway, his clipboard abandoned on the floor inside. His lips pressed into a thin line, his pride clashing with the undeniable force of what he had just witnessed. He wanted to speak to claw back authority, but his voice betrayed him. The crowd wasn't looking at him anymore. They were looking at the casket. Michael raised his hand, signaling the guard to halt just before the hearse. The pallbearers lowered the casket with precision, setting it on the stand prepared at the curb. The flag gleamed under the sun, each fold crisp, each star burning brighter than the winter sky. Helen stepped forward, pulling Lily beside her. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the flag, her fingertips brushing the cloth that now separated her from her son. "You kept your promise, Ethan," she whispered. "You came home right." Lily pressed her drawing against the flag. "This is for you, Daddy." The color smudged faintly against the wind, but the paper clung there for a moment, caught in the folds of the stars and stripes. The sight broke something open in the crowd. Tears flowed freely, shoulders heaved with silent sobs, and even hardened men who had sworn they'd never cry in public turned away, hands trembling at their sides. Michael stepped closer, reaching into his uniform pocket. From it, he withdrew a photograph, creased, worn, nearly faded. It showed two young soldiers, arms thrown around each other, grinning under a desert moon. Michael placed the photo gently in Helen's hands. "For you," he said softly, "from the night we promised each other. He made me swear I'd bring him home right, and I did. Because of you. Because of her." He nodded toward Lily. Helen's tears spilled, but she stood straighter, gripping the photo like a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping your word." The pallbearers lifted the casket once more and slid it carefully into the hearse. The thud of the doors closing echoed like a drumbeat across the curbside. Michael snapped into a salute, his white-gloved hand crisp against the brim of his cap. His arm locked steady, his body an unyielding pillar of respect. The crowd followed, not in uniformity but in sincerity. Some saluted, some pressed hands to their hearts. Some simply bowed their heads. The hearse engine rumbled low and steady, but it did not move yet. It waited as if honoring the silence. And then came the moment that shifted everything. Richard Collins stepped forward. At last, his suit wrinkled, his expression cracked open. He stopped beside Michael, not daring to touch the flag, not even daring to meet the sergeant's eyes at first. His voice was barely audible, but the silence carried it to all. "I was wrong." His throat tightened. "I didn't understand." Michael lowered his salute, turning his head just slightly. He didn't speak. His silence was louder than any words. Collins' shoulders sagged. For the first time in his career, he realized there was no efficiency metric that could capture this. No percentage of on-time departures could measure what it meant to honor sacrifice. He bowed his head. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't military, but it was sincere. The hearse began to roll slowly forward, carrying Ethan Ward on his final journey to Arlington. Michael's arm rose again in a salute, unwavering, until the black vehicle disappeared down the road. His body remained rigid, but his eyes burned with the weight of loss and the relief of a promise kept. The crowd didn't disperse immediately. They lingered as though unwilling to let go of the sacred silence that had settled over the airport. A businessman who had been rushing minutes before now stood with tears on his cheeks. A child saluted sloppily, mirroring Michael's stance. And Helen held Lily close, whispering words only the girl could hear. For a fleeting moment, the concourse, the curb, and the crowded heart of the airport had become something else entirely. Not a place of departure, but a place of remembrance. Michael exhaled slowly, lowering his hand. He turned his uniform still immaculate, his posture still unbroken. Yet inside he felt Ethan's voice one last time. "Thanks, brother. You did it right." Michael's jaw clenched. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply stood as a tomb guard stood, silent, steady, unyielding. And around him, strangers walked away, carrying something they hadn't come to the airport to find: the weight of honor. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that settled on the skin and refused to leave like the static before a thunderstorm. Officer Daniel Hayes stood near the terminal glass, his eyes fixed on the thug who had been mocking the tomb guard earlier. The airport had quieted, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was charged, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Families clutched their children tighter. Travelers whispered among themselves, and the soldiers escorting the casket stood rigid, their honor unshaken despite the disruption. The thug Marcus Red paced like a wolf in a cage, his jaw set, his fists twitching as though he was trying to summon the courage to make his next move. His smirk betrayed his arrogance, but the tremor in his fingers revealed what he tried to hide: fear. The tomb guard sergeant, Cole Harrison, hadn't flinched once. His gaze remained steady, locked on Marcus, as if he could bore straight into the man's soul with sheer discipline. Cole's every movement was deliberate, precise, controlled the same way he stood at the tomb of the unknown soldier, rain or shine, never breaking posture. "Back off, man," one of the bystanders whispered. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Marcus heard it. He snapped his head toward the voice, sneering. "He's just a guy in a uniform. You all think he's special, but I ain't scared of some toy soldier." The insult cut through the air like a blade, but Cole remained unmoved. His silence was louder than Marcus's words. That calmness only enraged Marcus further. He stepped closer, his heavy boots echoing on the tiled floor. "You hear me?" Marcus taunted, leaning forward. "You're nothing. You think standing straight makes you tough? You think silence is strength. Say something." Cole's voice finally broke the stillness. Low controlled, each word measured. "Respect is earned in silence." "You wouldn't understand." The crowd gasped. It wasn't the volume of the words, but the weight behind them. Marcus's face flushed crimson. He spat on the floor between them, the glob landing dangerously close to the draped coffin resting nearby. That single act shifted the atmosphere from tension to outrage. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the terminal. "Don't do it," Hayes muttered under his breath, stepping forward ready to intervene. But Cole lifted a hand, subtly signaling Hayes to hold back. This was his moment. His duty was not only to guard the fallen, but to show what honor truly looked like in the face of dishonor. Marcus squared his shoulders and shoved Cole hard in the chest. Cole staggered half a step back, but did not fall, his boots gripping the floor. his spine snapping back into its rigid line. The tomb guard training ran deep. Even violence couldn't strip him of his bearing. "You got nothing," Marcus shouted, emboldened by the shove. "I'll knock that look off your face, right here, right now." The crowd hushed the world, narrowing to the two men standing toe-to-toe. Hayes's hand hovered near his radio, unsure whether to call for backup or trust Cole to end this his own way. The casket gleamed under the harsh airport lights, a silent reminder of the stakes. Marcus swung first. A wild, sloppy punch fueled by rage rather than skill. Cole leaned just enough, the fist slicing through the air past his jaw. In that single precise movement, years of drilling discipline and unyielding focus converged. Cole's counter was swift, decisive, a flash of muscle and intent. His fist connected squarely with Marcus's jaw. The sound was sickening, a crack that seemed to echo across the terminal louder than any announcement. Marcus's body folded, teeth shattering under the impact, blood spraying as he crumpled to the ground. The onlookers erupted in gasps and cries, some shielding their children's eyes, others frozen in awe. Hayes rushed forward, but Cole was already standing tall again, his posture unbroken, his breathing steady. He didn't gloat, didn't move toward Marcus. He simply returned to his stance, hands clasped at his belt, as if nothing had happened. His silence roared louder than victory. Marcus groaned on the floor, clutching his ruined mouth, blood seeping between his fingers. His arrogance had shattered as thoroughly as his teeth. The man who had strutted through the airport minutes ago now lay in a heap of broken pride. Hayes knelt beside Marcus, securing him with practiced ease, his cuffs snapping around the thug's wrists. "You're done," Hayes said flatly. "It's over." The crowd began to applaud, first a few hesitant claps, then a rolling wave of cheers and shouts. Some cried, some saluted, others simply stared in reverence at the guard who had defended not just a coffin, but the sanctity of what it represented. Cole didn't acknowledge the applause. His eyes remained forward, locked on the casket, his stance unwavering. To him, this wasn't about glory. It was about duty. He had protected the honor of the fallen, and that was all that mattered. An older woman approached quietly, her face lined with grief. She carried a folded photograph of her son in uniform. Standing just a few feet from Cole, she whispered, her voice trembling, "Thank you for not letting him be disrespected." Cole didn't speak, but he gave the slightest of nods, his eyes softening just for a heartbeat. Then his face returned to stone, the weight of his responsibility pressing down again. As Marcus was dragged away, the airport regained its rhythm, though the moment would linger in every witness's memory. They had seen what respect looked like when tested, what silence could do when backed by conviction. And for Marcus Red, every broken tooth was a lesson carved in pain, a reminder that mocking honor had a price he would never forget. The terminal was buzzing again, but this time with a very different energy. The hush of disbelief had given way to chatter, the kind that spread like wildfire across every row of seats and every corridor. Phones were out, people recording voices, overlapping each person trying to put into words the shocking moment they had just witnessed. Yet in the middle of all that chaos, Sergeant Cole Harrison stood like an immovable pillar, his eyes still locked on the draped casket. Marcus Red had been dragged away in cuffs, his face a mangled mess of blood and broken teeth. But the echo of that single punch still lingered in the air. The crowd could almost feel it in their bones. Officer Hayes had expected Cole to relax now that the immediate threat was neutralized, but he didn't. The guard's stance remained locked, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling in controlled breaths. Hayes studied him, realizing this wasn't simply about one thug in an airport. This was about something much larger. A man in a suit, tall with a commanding presence, pushed his way through the onlookers. His coat was draped neatly over his arm, and the insignia on his lapel caught Hayes's eye immediately. Military, high-ranking. The murmurs confirmed it. "That's Colonel Whitaker," someone whispered, "from the Honor Guard Command." The colonel stopped in front of Cole, his gaze moving from the casket to the tomb guard, then to Hayes. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried a weight that made even the chatter around them dim. "I saw what happened," Whitaker said in a low, gravelly voice, "and I saw how you handled yourself, Sergeant." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. No hesitation, no showmanship, just precision. Cole finally spoke, his tone steady. "Sir, I did only what was required. The honor of the fallen had to be preserved. The colonel nodded once sharp and deliberate. And it was. But know this, what you did will not stay in this terminal. It's already spreading. He glanced at the countless phones still recording. By tonight, the whole country will know. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing the radio at his belt. Sir, with respect, there could be backlash. Internal affairs press spin lawsuits. Whitaker cut him off with a single raised hand. Officer, I've been in this game long enough to know when a fight will come and when it doesn't matter. This, he gestured at Cole at the casket at the spot where Marcus had fallen. This mattered. Let the cameras roll. The crowd erupted again, clapping and cheering. Someone shouted, "Hero." Another voice followed, "That's how you defend honor." Cole didn't move, didn't acknowledge it. Inside, though, there was a flicker of something, conflict. He wasn't trained to bask in applause, only to endure silence. The cheers grated against his discipline, but he knew their meaning. This wasn't for him. It was for what he represented. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, tugged at his mother's sleeve and stepped forward timidly. He clutched a small plastic soldier in his hand, its paint chipped, its rifle bent. "Mr. Guard," he said softly, his voice trembling but full of awe. "Are you really like the ones who stand all day at the tomb?" Cole finally looked down at him. For the first time since the altercation, his face softened more noticeably. He bent slightly at the knees, lowering himself so his gaze met the boy's. "Yes," he said. "We stand for those who can't anymore. Always." The boy gripped his toy tighter and nodded. His mother wiped a tear from her cheek, pulling him back into her arms. Around them, others grew silent again, their cheers giving way to reverence. The weight of those words settled on them, simple but unshakable. At that moment, Marcus Red's moans echoed faintly from down the corridor where paramedics were tending to him. The contrast was striking, the broken arrogance of a man who mocked sacrifice against the unbending poise of one who lived by it. Colonel Whitaker leaned closer to Hayes. "You'll need to file your report, officer. Make sure the truth is clear. Don't let bureaucracy twist this into something it wasn't." Hayes nodded, though he couldn't help but mutter, "Easier said than done." Whitaker's gaze hardened. "Then make it done." The colonel then turned back to Cole. "Sergeant Harrison, when this detail is complete, report to me directly. There will be questions, but there will also be recognition. Men like you remind this country what still holds us together." Cole gave the slightest nod. "Yes, sir." Whitaker straightened his presence, commanding the space as he moved away. The crowd parted respectfully, watching him leave, whispering in awe of the exchange they had just witnessed. Minutes ticked by, the airport slowly resuming its rhythm. Announcements for delayed flights crackled over the speakers. Children fussed, luggage wheels rattled, and life began again. Yet no one who had stood in that terminal would ever see airports or tomb guards the same way again. Hayes finally exhaled, stepping closer to Cole. "You realize what you've done, right? One punch, that's all it took. But it's going to ripple far beyond here. There'll be headlines, debates, maybe even hearings." Cole's eyes didn't waver from the casket. "Let them come. My duty doesn't change." Hayes shook his head, half in disbelief, half in admiration. "You guards, you're carved from a different stone." As the casket was prepared to move again, pallbearers adjusting their gloves, Cole returned to his exact stance, unbroken, resolute. The interruption had ended, but the journey wasn't over. Every step forward carried the weight of sacrifice, of eyes, watching, of history, being written not in marble, but in moments like this. And while Marcus Red's broken body was wheeled out on a stretcher, the crowd didn't follow him with their eyes. They looked only at the casket draped in the flag, and at the silent sentinel who stood beside it, refusing to falter. The honor of the fallen had been defended, but in defending it, Cole had unknowingly ignited something larger, a spark that would follow him long after he left this terminal. The ripple began before Sergeant Cole Harrison had even shifted his weight back into full attention. By the time the honor guard detail resumed its march down the concourse, the videos were already exploding across social media. Travelers who had stood stunned only moments earlier were now uploading clips, their captions raging with emotion. Tomb Guard drops thug in one punch, defending the fallen with honor. A teenage girl with a cracked phone case replayed the punch in slow motion on TikTok, her commentary trembling with excitement. A businessman in a suit sent his recording to a news station before boarding his flight. Within 20 minutes, hashtags began to climb, #TombGuard, #Honor First, #One Punch. Justice. The airport itself had become a pulsing nerve center of attention, the echoes of that brutal instant reverberating far beyond its walls. Yet Cole was untouched by it all. The cacophony of the terminal, the swirl of voices around him, it might as well have been silence. His eyes stayed on the casket, his body locked in that rigid form that had been drilled into him through months of sweat discipline and unforgiving correction. Officer Hayes, however, was anything but calm. As he walked slightly behind, scanning the shifting crowd, his radio buzzed with chatter. "We've got reporters on the line. Security wants a debrief. Command is asking if we need additional units." Hayes glanced at Cole, who gave no reaction. Copy Hayes muttered into the mic irritation in his tone. He envied the man's ability to stand above it all detached, while Hayes felt the weight of bureaucrats breathing down his neck already. The procession slowed near a row of gates where passengers had cleared a path. Their faces solemn, phones lowered out of respect. A woman in her 60s pressed a hand to her heart and whispered to her husband, "I haven't seen something like this since the funerals after Desert Storm." Her husband nodded. It's about time people remembered. They weren't alone. Everywhere Cole's detail passed, heads bowed, strangers saluted. A few veterans stood at attention, their posture imperfect, but their sincerity unmistakable. Even the janitor paused with his mop in hand, eyes glistening. The moment had transcended violence, it had become sacred. But in the upstairs office overlooking the terminal, the reaction was far different. Behind tinted glass, Airport Director Evelyn Harper stood with her arms folded tight across her chest. Her phone vibrated relentlessly, calls pouring in from press outlets and corporate partners alike. On one screen, the airport's internal feed replayed the scuffle in grainy security footage. On another, Twitter feeds refreshed in real time, the view count ticking upward in the hundreds of thousands. "Damn it," she muttered, pacing. "One punch and we're a headline." Beside her, a deputy manager tried to soften the blow. "Ma'am, from a PR standpoint, this could actually be don't say good," Harper snapped. "If this spins the wrong way, we'll be accused of endorsing violence. If it spins the other way, we'll be accused of failing to control our terminals. Either way, we lose." She paused, jaw clenched. "Get me legal. Get me the FAA rep, and find out who that officer was." Back on the floor, Hayes felt the shift in atmosphere as news crews rushed into the terminal with cameras perched on shoulders. He cursed under his breath. "Great. Here come the vultures." One reporter, brazen enough to push through the security perimeter, shouted over the din. "Sergeant Harrison, do you have a statement about what happened?" Cole didn't flinch. His eyes stayed forward, hands tight at his sides, every muscle taut with restraint. His silence only added fuel to the spectacle. The reporter tried again, jogging alongside. "Do you feel justified in striking a civilian? Was the use of force necessary?" Before Hayes could react, a Marine veteran in the crowd barked, "Necessary. That punk spit on the dead. You should be thanking him." His voice cracked with raw fury, and the crowd erupted into agreement, drowning the reporter's questions in a wave of cheers. Cole, still silent, guided the casket forward. The noise rose and fell behind him like a tide, but his focus never wavered. Each step was measured, each movement deliberate. Hayes leaned closer, muttering under his breath, "You know your silence is going to drive them crazier than any words would." "That's the point," Cole replied softly, almost imperceptibly. The officer blinked. "What do you mean?" Cole didn't elaborate. His eyes never left the flag-draped coffin. Meanwhile, Marcus Red was being wheeled into an ambulance at the far end of the terminal. Cameras captured his swollen face, his muffled curses spilling out around the gauze pressed to his shattered mouth. To the internet, he had already become a symbol mocked, ridiculed, turned into memes before the blood had even dried. In one viral clip, a commentator quipped, "He picked a fight with honor itself, and honor hit back." But beneath the noise, something more serious was stirring. At a federal building miles away, a duty officer received a flagged incident report. TombGuard involvement, potential escalation review requested. It was forwarded up the chain landing in the inbox of a defense liaison who frowned, recognizing the name Sergeant Cole Harrison. He picked up his phone. "Get me Colonel Whitaker. Tell him it's urgent." Back in the terminal, as the honor guard approached the waiting transport, Hayes felt the swell of tension rising all over again. What had started as a single punch had become a storm, political, cultural, and deeply personal. And at the center of it stood one man who refused to break his silence. As the casket was loaded with precision into the military transport, Cole finally allowed himself one brief breath. The crowd fell silent, heads bowed. And though his jaw was set like stone, Cole knew this was only the beginning. The world outside was about to close in on him, not with fists, but with questions, judgments, and forces. Even a guard's discipline might struggle to withstand. The flight carrying the casket had barely cleared the tarmac when the storm truly broke. By the time Sergeant Cole Harrison and Officer Hayes returned to their quarters for the night, the incident was already dominating the nation's airwaves. Cable news anchors spoke with the fervor of preachers looping the grainy clip again and again, the thug lunging the guard's fist like lightning, the collapse that followed. Commentators split along familiar lines. Some hailed it as righteous defense of honor. Others questioned whether an elite soldier had overstepped his authority in a civilian setting. In a cramped apartment in Arlington, Cole sat alone at his kitchen table. His posture was still straight, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. The faint glow of the television painted his expression in flashes of blue and white. He switched it off, preferring the silence, preferring the weight of his own thoughts over the babble of pundits. Across town, Colonel Whitaker wasn't granted such luxury. The Pentagon had already summoned him for a late-night call. His superiors wanted answers. Why was a tomb guard deployed through a public airport? Why had a situation been allowed to spiral into violence, and above all, who had authorized Cole's presence there? Whitaker bristled, jaw tight. He was escorting the remains of a fallen soldier. That is his duty. Are we questioning duty now, Colonel? One general replied coldly through the speaker. We are questioning optics. And right now, optics are running ahead of us. Whitaker exhaled slowly. He knew what that meant. Committees, hearings, and perhaps if the wolves smelled blood, Cole himself becoming the scapegoat. Meanwhile, at the airport hotel where many travelers had stayed overnight, a small crowd gathered in the lobby watching the clip on a giant screen. A veteran in a worn leather jacket raised his voice above the chatter. That man's a hero. He defended our honor. A younger woman countered, hero or not, he broke a man's face in a public place. There are rules. The room erupted into debate, the clip on loop behind them fueling every word. It wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a fault line splitting strangers, neighbors, even families. Back at his apartment, Cole finally stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the silent city. He had faced drills and pouring rain guardship through freezing nights, commands barked until his body shook. None of it had prepared him for this, the battle of perception. His phone buzzed. A text from Hayes. They're saying reporters are camped outside the base gates. Stay sharp. Cole typed back one word. Always. The next morning, the media frenzy intensified. Trucks with satellite dishes crowded the sidewalks. News anchors shouted into cameras, as if the fate of the nation hinged on one man's silence. Who is Sergeant Cole Harrison? Is he a protector or a problem? Inside the Pentagon. Whitaker pounded the table. He is neither. He is a guard. He doesn't bend to cameras or politics. He bends only to the oath he swore. But politics was already circling. In a Capitol Hill office, a senator reviewed the footage with his staff. This is bigger than one man. We can use this. Righteous strength versus chaos, it's an image voters understand. Another senator in another office told his aides the opposite. This proves militarization has gone too far. We'll call for a full inquiry. Make him the example. Across the country, everyday citizens were choosing sides without hesitation. Some wore T-shirts emblazoned with Cole's silhouette and the phrase "Honor Stands." Others launched petitions demanding his removal, claiming no one should be above civilian law. Through it all, Cole remained the same silent, disciplined, his jaw set against the storm. That evening, Hayes drove up to his building, rolling down the window. You should know you're trending worldwide. Cole raised an eyebrow. Trending isn't duty. Maybe not. Hayes said, but it's about to decide your future. Cole's eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon. He had faced down men with weapons, faced nights, where even his breath had to be silent. But now he sensed the real fight was only beginning not on the marble plaza of Arlington, but in the messy battlefield of politics, power, and public opinion. And as he turned back toward the door, he felt the shift in the air. The next battle wouldn't be decided by fists, it would be decided by who controlled the narrative of that single, devastating punch. The summons came at dawn. A military courier in crisp dress blues knocked firmly on Cole's apartment door, delivering a sealed envelope marked urgent. Inside, typed in blunt language, was the order: Sergeant Cole Harrison will appear before the Joint Oversight Committee at 0900 hours Capitol Building. Cole read it twice, then folded the paper neatly. There was no fear in his eyes, but there was a heaviness he knew. The arena he was about to step into was unlike any battlefield he had trained for. When he arrived at the Capitol, Washington was already buzzing. Camera crews lined the steps. Protesters shouted from both sides of the barricades, some waving flags with his face printed like a saint, others carrying signs that read, "No soldier above the law." The noise swelled into a clash of chants and jeers that rattled the marble columns. Inside the hearing chamber, rows of suited politicians adjusted their microphones. Journalists filled every seat of the gallery. Cole entered in full uniform, his chest ribbons gleaming under the harsh lights. His every step echoed with the discipline of the guard, but the silence he carried with him was louder than the crowd outside. Colonel Whitaker was already seated behind him, ready to testify if called. Hayes had managed to secure a visitor's pass and sat near the back, his jaw tight with anger at the circus unfolding. The committee chair, Senator Markham, struck his gavel. "We are here to investigate the incident at Reagan National Airport involving Sergeant Harrison, member of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment known as the Tomb Guards. Sergeant, you will answer truthfully and directly." Cole stood, squared his shoulders, and spoke in a calm tone. "Yes, sir." The senator leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Sergeant, did you or did you not physically assault a civilian on August 18th? Cole's eyes were steady. "I defended the casket of a fallen soldier from a hostile threat. I acted to prevent desecration and ensure the escort was not compromised." Hostile threat. Another senator scoffed. The man was unarmed. He charged the casket. Cole replied, voice even. His intent was clear. A weapon is not always steel or lead. Disrespect can cut deeper. The chamber murmured at his words. Some senators frowned, others scribbled notes. Markham raised a hand. "Sergeant Harrison, while the duty you describe is admirable, the nation must ask, are you accountable to military code, or do you believe your oath places you above civilian law?" Cole's answer came slowly, each syllable deliberate. "My oath binds me to something higher than myself, to guard the memory of those who gave everything. If that means standing between a thug and a casket, even if the law questions me afterward, then I will accept that weight." Gasps swept the chamber. Some called it arrogance. Others listening closely heard conviction. Colonel Whitaker finally interjected when granted the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you, the Tomb Guard is not just a soldier. He is a living sentinel of our national honor." Sergeant Harrison did not swing his fist out of anger. He did it because to do nothing would have been the true crime. The committee erupted. Voices overlapped. Cameras clicked. Reporters tapped furiously at keyboards. Meanwhile, outside on the steps, the crowd roared as word spread of Cole's words. Veterans raised their fists. A group of college students shouted back. Police formed lines, preparing for the clash of voices to become something worse. Back in the chamber, Senator Markham leaned forward again. "Sergeant Harrison, you realize your statement today could be taken as defiance of this very body." Cole didn't flinch. "With respect, sir, I don't serve this body. I serve the Guard. I serve the fallen." The silence that followed was thunderous. In that moment, Cole understood something he had always known on instinct, but had never spoken aloud. This wasn't about a fistfight in an airport anymore. It was about who defined honor in America, the lawmakers chasing optics, or the sentinels who stood in the shadows of marble and silence. The gavel slammed again. The hearing was far from over, but the battle lines had been drawn. Cole was no longer just a soldier on trial. He was the unwilling symbol of a nation divided between duty and politics. And as Hayes whispered under his breath from the back row, "They don't know who they're dealing with." Cole lifted his eyes to the senators, his stare as unyielding as the Guard itself. The committee had recessed for a brief lunch, but the storm outside did not stop. The sun beat down on the Capitol steps as two seas of protesters pushed against the barricades. Veterans with faded uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder with Gold Star families waving American flags, chanting Cole's name. Across from them, activists and critics shouted just as loudly, calling him a thug in uniform, demanding justice for the civilians struck at the airport. The air was electric, trembling with the weight of division. News vans broadcast live, their anchors speaking in hurried tones as the crowd swelled by the hundreds. Police reinforcements arrived in vans, their shields glinting under the light. Inside, Cole sat alone in a side chamber, staring at his gloved hands. His knuckles had healed from that single punch weeks ago, but the memory was still raw. He could still feel the thug's jaw crack against his fist, could still hear the shocked silence of the airport terminal afterward. He had done his duty. Yet here he was treated as if he were the one on trial for dishonor. Colonel Whitaker entered quietly and set a coffee down on the table. "You held your ground in there," he said, voice gruff but proud. Cole didn't answer immediately. "I'm not sure it matters. They don't want truth, Colonel. They want theater." Whitaker nodded, lowering his voice. "Maybe. But remember, sometimes theater is where nations decide what they stand for. Your words carry further than you know." Before Cole could respond, Hayes burst into the room, his face red with frustration. "It's getting ugly out there. Protesters clashing, police struggling to keep it under control. And the cameras. God, Cole, the cameras are eating this alive. You're the headline of the hour." Cole's jaw tightened. "What do they want from me?" "A spectacle." Hayes smirked bitterly. "You've already given them one. The question is whether you're going to let them turn you into a villain or something else." A knock at the door interrupted them. A Capitol security officer leaned in. "Sergeant Harrison, Senator Markham requests your presence outside. He believes your appearance could calm the crowds." Cole's eyes narrowed. "Or fan the flames." Whitaker gave him a hard look. "The decision is yours, son. But if you step out there, speak with the weight of the guard. Every word will echo." Cole rose slowly, his boots clicking against the tile. He adjusted his jacket, squared his shoulders, and followed the officer down the marble corridor. The sound grew louder with every step, the chants, the sirens, the crackle of megaphones. When he emerged onto the steps, sunlight flooded across his uniform. The crowd erupted, half in cheers, half in jeers. Cameras zoomed in their lenses, swallowing his every expression. Police shifted nervously, shields raised. Cole stood tall at the top of the stairs. For a moment he simply looked out over them, the sea of faces, some twisted in anger, others uplifted with hope. Then he raised one gloved hand, palm forward, commanding silence. The noise faltered, curiosity overtaking fury. His voice carried across the plaza, strong and unwavering. "You shout because you care about this country. So do I. But let me tell you what matters more than fists or arguments, the silence of the fallen. That silence is what I protect. That silence is why I acted. Not for myself, for them." A hush rippled through the crowd. Even the cameras seemed to lean in closer. Cole stepped down one stair. "You may not like me. You may think I went too far. But ask yourself this: when a man tries to disgrace the memory of a soldier who gave his last breath for your freedom, would you stand aside or would you stand up?" Murmurs spread. Some faces softened. Veterans saluted. A Gold Star mother wept openly, clutching a folded flag. But on the other side, critics shouted back. "No one is above the law," one man roared. Others chanted it with him, fists in the air. Police tensed as the two sides edged closer. Cole's gaze hardened. He stepped forward again, voice like thunder now. "Law without honor is paper. Honor without law is chaos. We must have both. That's what I swore to defend." The crowd trembled between silence and explosion. Cameras clicked furiously. Reporters whispered into their microphones, calling it the speech that could define a generation. But Cole wasn't finished. He raised his chin. "If you want to condemn me, condemn me. If you want to honor me, honor me. But don't fight each other. Don't trample the very unity those buried at Arlington gave their lives for. If you do, then all of this, all of them, will have been for nothing." For a moment, the entire plaza held its breath. Then slowly the veterans lowered their flags. The chanting faltered. Even the angriest critics seemed caught in hesitation, uncertain how to answer the soldier who had just stripped the argument bare. Cole turned without waiting for applause, his boots echoing on the steps as he walked back inside. The cameras followed him until the heavy doors closed. Inside, Hayes exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for hours. "You realize you just put half of Washington on notice?" Cole looked at him evenly. "Not half. All of it." The heavy oak doors swung shut behind Cole, sealing the noise of the crowd outside. For a heartbeat, silence reigned in the marble hall, broken only by the echo of his boots. Whitaker followed close, his eyes sharp but calm. Hayes darted ahead already on his phone, muttering about networks scrambling to replay Cole's words. Inside the chamber, the senators had reconvened. Their aides whispered in hushed tones, passing papers and updating social feeds. Senator Markham, his jaw set like stone, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. Across from him, Senator Dwyer, who had grown sympathetic to Cole during earlier testimony, sat rigid, arms crossed. The stage was set for confrontation. As Cole took his seat, Chairman Hollis rapped the gavel. "Order. We will resume testimony." His tone was clipped, but beneath it was unease. He knew the weight of the moment. Everyone did. Senator Markham leaned forward, voice booming. "Sergeant Harrison, while you were out there delivering speeches to rile the public, this committee obtained testimony from a so-called witness, a civilian who claims you assaulted him without provocation. He paints a very different picture than your story." Cole's spine stiffened. His hands clasped on the table, but he did not flinch. "What witness?" Markham's smile widened, predatory. "Mr. Trent Maloney. Does that name sound familiar?" The name cut like a blade. "Maloney. The thug from the airport, the man who had jeered at the soldier's casket, spat on the guard's duty, and then lunged forward. The man Cole had dropped in a single punch." The doors at the back opened, and Maloney entered, dressed in a clean suit jaw wrapped in a faint bandage for theatrical effect. He swaggered, smirking as cameras zoomed in. He played his role like a man savoring revenge. Cole's jaw tightened. Hayes muttered a curse under his breath. Maloney took the witness seat and raised his hand half-heartedly for the oath. "I swear to tell the truth," he said, grinning sideways at Cole. Senator Markham gestured. "Mr. Maloney, tell us what happened." Maloney leaned into the microphone, feigning humility. "Well, Senator, I was simply at the airport paying respects. The soldier's ceremony was moving. Then this guard," he pointed at Cole, sneering, "this so-called honorable man, struck me out of nowhere. Broke my teeth, shattered my jaw. I was no threat. I was unarmed. I was just speaking my mind." Gasps filled the chamber. The cameras snapped like gunfire. Cole's fists curled under the table, but Whitaker placed a calming hand on his shoulder. Markham seized the moment. "You see, colleagues, this is what I've been warning about. An armed man in uniform abusing his authority, brutalizing civilians. If we allow this to stand, what precedent are we setting? That the tomb guard can decide who has free speech and who doesn't." He let the question hang in the air, smugness radiating from his grin. Chairman Hollis turned toward Cole. "Sergeant, do you have a response?" Cole leaned forward slowly, voice low but firm. "Yes, I do." "Maloney is lying." A stir rippled through the chamber. Maloney scoffed. Of course he'd say that. He's trying to save his skin. Cole's eyes locked on the senators. The cameras were rolling at that airport. There were witnesses, families, veterans, children. Every one of them saw what happened. Maloney didn't speak his mind. He mocked the dead. He spit on a casket. He shoved through mourners and reached for my weapon. That's when I stopped him. With one strike. Nothing more. Nothing less. Markham barked out a laugh. "How convenient. No evidence. Just your word against his." But Hayes leapt to his feet, waving a folder. "Wrong. There is evidence." The airport security footage, which this committee conveniently ignored, shows Maloney making the first move. And he flipped pages dramatically. We also have sworn statements from 3 bystanders, including a Gold Star widow. Would you like me to read them into the record? Senator Markham's face blanched. The room erupted with murmurs. Maloney shifted uneasily, sweat beginning to bead at his temple. That's fabricated. They're lying for him." Cole stood, his presence filling the chamber. The truth doesn't need fabrication. The truth stands even when cowards try to bury it. His eyes bored into Maloney. You tried to dishonor the dead, and when you lunged, you were stopped. Not because I hate you, but because I swore to protect the honor you mocked. The silence that followed was thunderous. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in on every expression, the fury in Cole's eyes, the panic on Maloney's face, the discomfort in Markham's forced composure. Senator Dwyer finally spoke, her voice cool and cutting. Mr. Maloney, you've committed perjury here today. I suggest you think carefully before you continue digging your own grave. Maloney sputtered, his smirk gone. Markham slammed a hand on the table, desperate to regain control. This is not a circus. Cole's reply was calm, steady, but deadly sharp. No, Senator. This is supposed to be about honor, and the only circus here is the one you invited. The gavel pounded. Hollis tried to restore order, but the chamber was already transformed. The narrative had shifted. The accused had become the accuser, and the cameras captured it all, the beginning of a reckoning. Cole sat down slowly, his expression unreadable, but his voice carried like iron. I will not bow to lies. Not here, not anywhere, not while a single soldier rests beneath that marble stone at Arlington. The senators whispered among themselves, some shaken, others enraged. But for the first time, Cole had seized control of the storm. The room simmered with tension. The senators' whispers were a low tide against the thunder still echoing from Cole's words. Hollis tapped the gavel, demanding order, but his voice trembled just enough to betray unease. Cameras panned across every face, capturing sweat-clenched jaws, and the taut lines of conflict carved into the chamber. Senator Markham, his lips tight as piano wire, leaned back and forced a cold smile. Impressive speech, Sergeant Harrison. But speeches don't outweigh facts. You say you have footage, you say you have statements. Convenient. Yet this committee hasn't seen them authenticated. He rose, adjusting his suit jacket like armor. And I don't trust scraps of paper waved around by a lawyer playing theatrics. His glare swept toward Hayes. Hayes shot back. I'm not playing theatrics. I'm presenting evidence your office has deliberately suppressed. Gasps rippled again, and Markham pounced. Objection. Accusations without proof. You'll answer for this, counselor. Cole leaned forward, voice cutting through the noise like steel. Answer this instead, Senator. Who coached Maloney? Who paid his lawyer fees? Who arranged for his testimony here today? Markham's jaw twitched, but he kept the smile plastered on. The witness is a citizen exercising his right to be heard. Don't lie, Cole said flatly. The bluntness drew murmurs. Even Hollis blinked at the audacity. Markham slammed a hand on the desk. You dare accuse a senator of lying? Cole stood, his presence commanding, shoulders squared. I dare defend the dead from slander. If that means calling out the liars who enable cowards, then yes, Senator, I dare. For a moment, the chamber teetered on chaos. Some senators banged the table in protest, others leaned forward as if unwilling to miss a single syllable. The audience in the gallery leaned over the railings, hungry for every flicker of drama. Hollis rapped the gavel again. Order Sergeant Harrison, sit down. This committee is not your battlefield. Cole did not sit. He stared straight at Markham. Every ground I stand on becomes a battlefield when the truth is under attack. The words landed heavy like a declaration carved in stone. Markham saw control slipping. Desperation crept in. He straightened papers before him and snapped, Very well. If the sergeant insists on fighting shadows, perhaps it's time we reveal what's been hidden. Mr. Chairman, I submit classified records obtained through channels of national security clearance. The room froze. Classified. Hayes stiffened. Whitaker's brow furrowed. Cole narrowed his eyes. Markham held up a thick folder stamped and sealed. These documents detail disciplinary reports from Sergeant Harrison's early service, reports of aggression, reports of excessive force, incidents swept conveniently under the rug by his commanding officers. He let the words drip with poison, each syllable meant to puncture Cole's credibility. Excessive force, Markham repeated, savoring it. A pattern of violence. And now you expect us to believe that Maloney's jaw was the first bone you broke out of duty. The senators erupted into chatter. The audience murmured. The cameras zoomed closer, devouring Cole's reaction. Cole remained still, but a storm roiled behind his eyes. His voice was calm, but each word was edged like a blade. Those reports, if they exist, don't tell the truth. They tell fragments twisted by men who didn't care about the context. They don't tell about the ambush in Fallujah. They don't tell about the civilians I shielded while under fire. They don't tell about the soldiers who walked out alive because I took the hit. But of course, Senator, you wouldn't mention that. Markham smirked. Always the martyr, aren't you? But this time you won't hide behind flag-draped coffins. Hayes slammed a fist on the table. This is a smear campaign. Those files were sealed. You had no legal right. Markham cut him off, raising his voice to the gallery as much as the senators. The people deserve to know who's standing guard over their sacred tombs. A man with a history of violence. A man unfit to wear the badge of honor. Cole finally sat his face a mask of stone. Inside, though, he felt the walls closing. Every word Markham spoke was designed to bury him alive. The cameras would take the soundbite, rip it from context, and spread it like wildfire. He knew it. But then, the chamber doors opened with a creak that cut through the noise. Heads turned. A figure stepped inside, escorted by Capitol security. A woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled into a bun wearing a plain black dress. She walked with quiet dignity, clutching a folded flag close to her chest. The gallery hushed. Senators leaned back. Even Markham faltered. Chairman Hollis frowned. "Ma'am, this is a closed hearing." The woman raised her voice strong despite the tremor. "My name is Margaret Sloan. My son, Corporal Daniel Sloan, was laid to rest at Arlington last year, and I was there at that airport when Sergeant Harrison defended that casket." Her words rang like a bell in the silence. Cameras swiveled, snapping furiously. Markham barked, "This is highly irregular. She has no standing." But Hollis held up a hand, silencing him. For once, the chairman looked more human than procedural. "Let her speak." Mrs. Sloan clutched the flag tighter, her eyes brimming but fierce. "I saw Maloney. I saw him mock my son's sacrifice. I saw him spit. I saw him reach for the guard's weapon. And I saw Sergeant Harrison protect us. He didn't act out of violence. He acted out of honor, out of duty, out of love for a soldier he didn't even know." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on louder. "If you condemn him, you condemn every soldier who ever stood watch over the fallen. You condemn my son." The chamber was silent except for the ragged breath of Maloney, who shifted nervously in his seat. Markham's face drained of color. Cole's throat tightened, but he stayed silent, letting her words echo. Mrs. Sloan turned locking eyes with the senators. "Shame on you if you let politics tarnish the truth. Shame on you." She lowered herself into a seat at the witness table, folding her hands calmly over the flag. The chamber erupted not in chaos, but in applause. It began with the gallery, then spread. Hollis banged the gavel, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of respect in his eyes. Cole exhaled slowly. The storm hadn't passed, but the tide had shifted again, and he knew deep down that Part 18 would be the final reckoning. The chamber's air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Margaret Sloan's testimony had cut through every crafted lie, like sunlight breaking storm clouds. But Markham wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice trembling with both anger and fear. "This is sentiment, not evidence," he snapped, pointing toward Mrs. Sloan. "We cannot let emotions cloud judgment. Sergeant Harrison is dangerous." Dangerous." Mrs. Sloan shot back before he could finish, her voice ringing clear. "The only danger I felt that day was from the man you defend, from Maloney." The gallery erupted in murmurs louder than ever. Cameras swung to capture Markham's faltering expression, the tightness around his mouth betraying his panic. Hayes seized the moment, standing with a binder clutched in his hand. "Mr. Chairman, members of this committee, enough talk. You want evidence? Then let's show it." He turned toward the aides. "Roll the footage." The large screen behind the panel flickered to life. Grainy security camera footage filled the room. It showed the airport terminal, the casket draped in a flagpole at his post. The crowd watched as Maloney approached, smirking, gesturing crudely at the coffin. Gasps filled the chamber when he spat. Then the image caught the flash of his hand darting toward the tomb guard's holstered weapon. The footage froze at the precise moment Cole's fist connected with Maloney's jaw. Teeth flew, the thug crumpled. Silence swallowed the room. Hayes let the frame linger. This was not aggression, this was prevention. That weapon could have discharged in a crowded terminal. Dozens could have died. Sergeant Harrison acted with restraint, striking once, subduing the threat. That's not violence, that's valor. The senators shifted in their seats. Some whispered fiercely. Others sat stiff, their eyes glued to the screen. Markham slammed his palm on the table. This proves nothing. That footage could be doctored, but the words sounded brittle, desperate. Whitaker rose, his booming voice cutting across the noise. Senator Markham, enough. The American people can see the truth. This hearing has become a stage for your vendetta, but it ends now. He gestured toward Cole. This man has given his blood, his sweat, and his peace of mind to guard those who cannot defend themselves. And you, he jabbed a finger at Markham, have tried to bury him under lies. Markham tried to retort, but his words stumbled. Hollis, weary and grave, lifted the gavel. The committee has heard enough. The hammer struck wood, echoing like a shot. These proceedings are concluded. Sergeant Harrison acted within his duty. This hearing is adjourned. The gallery exploded into cheers. Cameras zoomed on Cole, who sat unmoving, the relief in his chest hidden behind the soldier's discipline carved into him by years of standing still before the tomb. But his hands resting on the table trembled slightly, not from fear, but from release. Maloney was escorted out, clutching his broken jaw, his eyes wild. He muttered curses, but they were drowned out by the noise of the crowd. For the first time, his swagger was gone. Markham, pale and sweating, gathered his papers in shaking hands. He turned toward the exit, but the cameras followed, recording every ounce of his humiliation. He would survive this day politically, perhaps, but his reputation would never recover. Cole rose slowly, turning toward Mrs. Sloane. Their eyes met. She stood clutching her folded flag. She whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "Thank you." He nodded once, his throat too tight to answer. As the room emptied, Hayes clapped a hand on Cole's shoulder. "You did more than defend yourself today. You defended every soldier who ever stood a post." Cole finally allowed himself a faint smile. "I didn't do it for me." He looked toward the flag in Mrs. Sloane's arms. "I did it for him. For all of them." Outside the chamber, the crowd waited, reporters, citizens, veterans in uniform. When Cole stepped through the doors, they surged forward, not with jeers, but with applause. Phones captured the moment, live streams carried it across the country. To millions watching, he was no longer just a soldier, he was a symbol. A young boy pushed through the legs of the crowd, holding out a small plastic soldier toy. His father, a veteran in a wheelchair, wheeled closer behind him. The boy looked up at Cole with wide eyes. "Mister, can you hold it?" Cole knelt, taking the toy gently. He studied it, then pressed it back into the boy's hand. "No, son. You hold it. One day you'll understand why." The boy's father saluted. Cole returned the salute without hesitation. As Cole walked away, the cameras followed, but his gaze was elsewhere, toward the horizon, toward the tomb of the unknowns, where duty waited silently as it always had. The storm was over. His honor was intact. But he knew the fight for respect, for memory, for truth would never end. And that was fine, because Cole Harrison would never stop standing guard. If you like the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more similar stories. Now click on the video on the screen to hear another story that is equally powerful and compelling, with courage, sacrifice, and a choice that makes you question everything you know about duty and justice. Click on the video.